I remember seeing like a TikTok video a while back where this kid was complaining about how Minnesota is boring, like there's nothing to do here in Minnesota, framing it in a way as if to assume that there was something in our soil or water supply that just made this state boring. I scoffed at the video. I was thinking to myself, we have such a great theater scene and music scene. We have the Mall of America, cool art museums, even great state parks if you're into that. But then I really began to think about it, and I actually asked myself the question, where do people go for fun? Here in America, and actually a lot of other places, we have a severe lack of public spaces, and it's made our cities boring, unhealthy, and antisocial. Public spaces are spaces that are generally free and accessible to all people most of the time. So think public libraries, think of community centers that can stay up late, city blocks that are closed down to cars so people can bike, walk, or just hang out in them, or even just a couple swings in an open field. In this video, I want to talk about our public space crisis.
Hello? Look! Hey! Listen!
A lot of these problems stem from the fact that we've created a country centered around private life and development. Only 30% of Americans talk to their neighbors, with the feeling of trust between neighbors falling since the 20th century. Driving all alone takes up about 85% of all work commutes. We can drive to the convenience store and not have to talk to anybody. Go through the drive-thru without leaving our car. Our land use really reflects our car usage. Like this image of downtown Phoenix, where 52% of our land is strictly for car movement or storage. That doesn't leave a lot of space for parks, common areas, or much of really anything else besides simply retail and office space. I feel like we haven't built a lot of public spaces and a lot of public spaces well because we've designed and built our environment with private ownership of land in mind. We're really content in an individualistic society, even if it's made our public spaces worse off for it. In America's 100 largest cities, only half of residents live within half a mile from a park, and POC and low-income communities have even worse access. In LA, predominantly white neighborhoods have about 31.8 acres of park space for every 1,000 people. In predominantly African American and Hispanic neighborhoods, that number is only 1.7 and 0.6 acres per 1,000 people, respectively. And this can lead to huge health inequities, as a study researching the effects of public green space, such as parks, found that green spaces encourages health through physical activity like walking, biking, and jogging. These physical activities reduce obesity in both children and adults, as well as many cardiovascular diseases. And it's not just physical health. Studies have shown that in global cities, public green space can help reduce mood disorders, stress, and depression within citizens' lives. And this is an issue that I feel like gets overlooked all the time when we talk about urban design. People like to think that the suburbs or really dense cities are lonely or are depressing, but a lot of that just comes down to the fact that some cities just don't have enough public spaces where you can actually talk to people, where you can feel like, at least passively, you're a part of a community. You're always just shut off. Whether it's in the suburbs where you are in the car all the time so you don't get to see people unless you're at a grocery store, or in the city where everyone kind of seems like just a random face until you are actually able to meet face to face with them. Without public spaces, you just feel alone. And this has been backed up by countless studies accounting for the public health crisis that we're facing. Mental health issues such as depression and anxiety are so much higher in places that just don't have public spaces. Researchers investigated mental health in urban centers in Denmark and found that compared to rural areas, people living in cities and towns had a much higher relative risk of developing a psychiatric disorder. But the study found that people who had the least amount of green space access were 55% more likely to develop psychiatric disorders. The way to counteract this? More public green space like parks. Green space in cities helps people find peace outside their busy lives and causes positive mental health outcomes. Without adequate parks and outdoor recreation, we as a country are failing to give ourselves a healthy environment to live in, even more so for low-income and POC communities. And I know many people are going to ask why I'm talking about underserved communities all the time, why I always bring up race and class and age. But I think when you look at how much it disproportionately hurts those communities that don't have access to transportation, that can't get to a park that's far away, that needs public spaces in their area, I think it's a gross oversight to overlook that. When there's been studies done on social isolation and senior citizens because they don't have enough public spaces, we have to ask, when our kids don't have access to the parks that we think that suburbs provide, we have to ask if that's how we want America to be designed like. Moving on beyond just green space, not having enough public spaces also hurts our social health. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why I made this video in the first place. The busyness, noisiness, and dangerousness of car-dominated cities causes people to feel disconnected and can stop people from creating meaningful connections. These negative factors keep people from participating in community events, which leads to neighborhoods feeling quite isolated and less cohesive. Public space keeps that from happening. Places like recreation centers and public libraries act as a meeting place for people of all backgrounds to talk and socialize. It's easy to be fearful of your neighbors and other people in your community when you don't actually get to see them and interact with them and their own culture. Participating in a block party with them, sitting on a bench in the park together as your kids play with their kids, or just seeing each other at the farmer's market helps break down socioeconomic barriers that otherwise might exist in our other facets of life. There's safety in numbers with public spaces, and with more activities happening in one space, a lot of people going in and out, it creates an atmosphere of safety and allows people, like small kids, to be able to play without the risk of something bad happening to them. Why do you think college students during the pandemic were praying to go back in person eventually? Because making meaningful connections online is infinitely harder than doing it in person. Even if you're just sitting alone in the park, you still feel like you're passively participating in the community. College just wouldn't be the same if we didn't have our public spaces. It really improves the entire vibe of a college town. When you extrapolate that to our normal cities, we have to ask the question, why don't we build enough public spaces? We don't have enough spaces where people can just socialize or be a part of community, hang out after school, organize a neighborhood meeting, or simply just play cards and talk to each other. The communities that we make are usually happenstance. The people you meet at your kid's ball game, your direct neighbors, the people you work with. But that's not representative of the larger community. We as a country are getting more anxious, we're getting more depressed, we're getting more lonely. And even though that is a large part of a much larger issue, a lot of that does stem from the fact that the way that we're building our cities, the way that we're designing our lives to be like, is not conducive for social interaction. And there's no community center where you can have fun activities or anything of the sorts. Even very casually, there's not enough chairs, benches, green spaces on the sides of busy downtown streets that make the city feel welcome, that make you feel like you're a part of city. Even in Minneapolis, which I think is a great city that does a lot of things really well, there are certain streets in downtown that are so bare. And we know why they're bare. It's to keep homeless people out of there. It's to make sure people don't loiter. But the vibrancy that people like to think that Minneapolis has, that cities of similar size have, is kind of lost when you don't have that social interaction built in, when you don't welcome it and instead kind of shove it away. And to really hone in on what, made me want to make this video, what really inspired me, which is teenagers like myself at one point, not having enough places to just hang out. A lot of times people like to say, the suburbs are boring, but it's a good place to raise your family. And every time I've heard that, I have to ask, why? Why does the suburbs being boring and having nothing to do, why is that a positive for parents? Why is it a positive thing to latch onto when you raise your family? And imagine you're a kid growing up and you don't have access to a place that can really benefit your social, physical, and mental health. That seems like kind of a ripoff. People complain about how kids don't play outside when the nearest library could be 2 miles away. The nearest park you might have to cross an entire highway to get to. We just don't have enough public spaces, and sometimes our public spaces just aren't high quality enough. Like, do you want your kids to be bored? Is that what you want? Do you want your kids to, potentially have a higher risk of developing mental disorders? Do you not want your kids to make healthy connections with friends in their neighborhood on their own terms in, say, a rec center, or participate in community events in a community center? For teenagers and college-aged adults like myself, our spaces are inherently exclusive. If you don't have money, restaurants, bars, and stores are off the list. If you are too old, then playgrounds aren't for you. If you don't have a car, then libraries and rec centers just might be too far away. If you live in a cold climate, then outdoor parks and state parks are just not an option for half of the year. And if you're a teenage girl, then all of these might apply. At least that's what Susanna Walker, co-founder of the British charity Make Spaces for Girls, argues. She states that there aren't enough spaces for teen girls. Surveys show that they're less likely to use basketball courts or skate parks, which, while also admittedly in short supply in many cities, are supposed to be geared towards adolescents. An art installation went up in Boston in 2014, known as Swing Time, where 20 hoop-shaped swings were suspended on a structure and lit up to the motion of the swings. This installation was such a huge success in getting people together, and for people like Walker and other proponents of public spaces, this is exactly the type of space that they want to emulate. They advocate inner public spaces for better lighting, circular seating options for sitting in groups instead of just sitting in a line, and also circular paths surrounding the perimeter of the park or public space in general, among other things. These are all features in a public space that, when surveyed, teen girls seem to prefer. So by pushing for some of these changes, we can make our public spaces even more accessible to a subgroup that is often overlooked. And this type of placemaking doesn't just benefit teen girls or POC or low-income neighborhoods. Really, by building and designing our environment to be more democratic and accessible to all people in a community, it helps everybody in that area, whether it be physically, mentally, or socially. It all comes down to how we make sure that these spaces are designed for the wants and the needs of the communities that it will serve. So how do we make public spaces both accessible and effective? Well, to take an example out of my own local neighborhood, many people in my area, specifically Asian and Hispanic families, like to use parks as a place to host their birthday parties. So given this need, it's important that these public spaces, these public parks, have enough shade provided by the gazebos, enough tables using picnic tables, enough grills in the area, and access to adequate bathrooms. In an area with a large senior population, it's important to have a lot of green space and community centers that are easily walkable. And since they might not have a huge disposable income, have that community center or rec center have a lot of free activities. Or in a city that has an especially diverse population, closing down a city block to automobiles so it's just pedestrians allows people to be able to share their community, share their culture, their music, their food in that area. Really, it's a win-win for everybody. In general, good public spaces need 4 attributes. Accessibility. How easy is it to get to your public space? Whether it be through walking, transit, or biking, it needs to be able to be easily linked to the rest of the neighborhoods and communities in the surrounding area. If you have a public park that's just a block away, but you have to cross 5 lanes of a highway to get to, then it might not be as accessible as it needs to be a good public space that serves its community. It also needs to be comfortable. And I'm not just talking about, physically comfortable, but also visually. Does it seem safe? Is it clean? And yes, is it comfortable to be in? Third is flexibility with use. Plopping down a garden in the middle of a neighborhood doesn't really do much to add to the neighborhood as a whole. Yes, the garden might be nice to look at and walk through, but it's not really engaging the community and, being a very flexible place where multiple activities can be held. Instead, maybe make a community garden where people can not just walk through and look at, but also play an active role in gardening and growing those crops. You can have multiple activities in this public space, which in whole makes the public space more useful. And lastly, sociability. How easy does the public space make it for people to come together and meet friends and family, meet strangers even, and have a good positive time? And what I like about this topic is that these movements are happening. There is political will and action being taken towards building better and more public spaces. According to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Americans are generally for more investment into our public spaces. And we've seen a push for more car-free zones in cities, especially during the pandemic where indoor space was avoided. Parking lots and car zones have been transformed into sitting areas for local restaurants. City blocks have been shut down for cars to create temporary open street block parties. This is happening in Chicago, where the city council has approved new pedestrian streets in the West Loop. These city streets are going to be expanded in order to increase access to public spaces within Chicago. These city streets have been closed before. In fact, when West Fulton Street was closed down and turned into a pedestrian wonderland, it saw a 25% increase in foot traffic due to it. And other streets across the nation has seen 68% increases in foot traffic overall. Despite the internet, the library and community centers are still seen as civic goods, with a visit to the library still being the most common cultural activity in America and circulation of books having increased over the years. Reinvesting in community spaces would only cost about the equivalent of a few miles of freeway, and we could use that type of money in order to fund more and better public spaces. I want to make sure that growing up, kids have something to do. That there are places in our cities that are for everyone, not just for those who have money, not just for those who look a certain way, but for everyone to be able to laugh, walk, and play in. I want kids and teens to be transported to different worlds thanks to their local library, to be able to play in the grass at parks that they can go to alone, to see their friends at a community center where they can exist without a fee. I don't want kids to have to walk the lonely aisles of Target and Walmart for exercise. That sucks. For their cars to be the only means of in-person socialization. That also sucks. For half the world to be inaccessible to them. In a world where politicians and the general public alike love to promote how much they care about safety and education and health and bringing people together, we sure are not doing any of that sometimes. And I think that just really, really needs to change.